Imagine being conned out of your pension pot and then being forced to pay tax on the money that you no longer have.
Let's explain this. It's what's happened to hundreds of people who have fallen victim to a particular scam. Now, Moneybox's Dan Whitworth is here to tell us more. Morning, Dan, along with Margaret Snowdon from the Pension Scams Industry Group. Margaret, morning to you as well. And I'm sure you've heard of lots of cases that this has been happening to as well. But, Dan, shall we get you to explain what's been going on?
So this all started in many cases around about 2010. And what happens in most of the cases I've come across is that people who'd earned a decent pension by then, but who were still under the age of 55, that's key, and we'll explain why in a minute. So people like nurses, firemen and women, police officers, public sector pensions, they were targeted by dishonest financial advisors. They were basically told, we can make your pension savings work harder for you. So we can give you a bit of a cash sum and we'll reinvest the rest and it'll work harder for you and it'll make up that difference. Essentially what happened is that money in most cases was stolen by these scammers, and part of the sales process, the sales pitch by these people was, oh, and don't worry, the tax liabilities for withdrawing your pension early, which there are if you take your pension savings before 55, don't worry, this scheme is not liable for that tax. So what's happened in many cases is not only have these victims, they've had their money stolen, their retirement savings stolen, now the campaigners would say they're being victimised a second time because HMRC is coming to them and say, oh, you know that money you've had stolen? Well, actually, you are liable for tax for it. And in many cases, that's 55% of the money that was stolen. We are talking big bills. Now, there's a lady called Sue Flood, and she is a victim's representative on an all-party parliamentary group, a campaign group on investment fraud. It happened to her, and not only did she and her husband lose around £230,000 of their savings, their pension, their future, they're also now fearing that they're going to be presented with a six-figure bill from HMRC. And she told me the impact it's having on people like her and other victims.
Suicidal thoughts, mental breakdown, broken marriages, lost jobs, financial ruin and bankruptcy. And they even reported that their children who are living under this quagmire, it was reported that they faced ruin because of the kids had self-harm, low self-esteem, sickness, absence, school refusing. I mean, the only difference between us and those poor post offices, we haven't gone to prison yet.
So you get a sense there, don't you, of what a significant difference this can make. And how are people falling victim to this sort of thing, Margaret?
Yeah, and as Dan said, there are sophisticated advisors who are out there telling people that they could make more money for the future by doing a particular thing. Now, they were frankly lying to people.
It's nonsense, isn't it?
It's complete nonsense, but you say, how could people fall for it? They're very convincing. And actually, the schemes that they were asking people to transfer to were approved by HMRC themselves. So they looked quite respectable. So, you know, an ordinary person isn't going to spot that there's something illegal about that.
And the problem is that money just never makes it to those...
It gets to those schemes and then it's siphoned off from those schemes, either as expenses or as money to the organisers, and they go off and buy houses and yachts and things with that money. And it sometimes takes a while for a person to even realise that that great deal they did was a scam.
You know what, Dan? You have sat here many a time talking about how the banks will refund money that's lost to fraud, and we've spoken about the rates and the success of that. When you look at what HMRC is doing now, it comes down to what their responsibilities are, and also when they specifically say, and you've got to kind of go right into the language, we do not tax pension savings lost to fraud. However,
I'm going to carry, excuse me, Naga, I'm going to carry on some of that statement because also it says, HMRC, it has a responsibility to collect the tax people legally owe it to maintain a fair system for all. I think crucially on HMRC's response, I think the language is shifting a little bit because it goes on to say, obviously all this in the midst of the post office scandal, huge, great, you know, publicity about that. A lot of these victims are saying it's a very similar case. HMRC says, take the well-being of all taxpayers seriously, and it does everything it can for those who engage with them to get their tax affairs in order. that doesn't stop what's happening. And the campaigners would say, again, as I mentioned earlier, that they are being victimised twice.
Yeah. But Margaret, isn't the point that the money then, as you told us, is moving to legitimate funds, but the money's being siphoned off? So as far as HMRC is concerned, they're looking and saying, well, yeah, you've taken your money out, you've put it in a fund. All the costs and associated money that's gone elsewhere isn't our responsibility.
Yeah, and that's quite a logical thing to say, actually. But the main point is that people didn't know that what they were doing was wrong. And if you don't know it's wrong, it's a bit hard to say, you know, you should be punished for having done that. And it's actually a different world. In 2010, if you think we'd just gone through the financial crisis, people were a bit nervous about, you know, their futures. So they were vulnerable to people coming along and saying, I can do something great for you. And it looked legitimate. And in fact, it's taken years to find out that they're not legitimate. And HMRC put in claims for tax to people without really knowing the facts.
I'm still, Dan, you're going to have to take me through this statement again, right? So, we do not tax pension savings lost to fraud. What we do tax are amounts that people release or attempt to release from their pensions where not authorised in law. But they've released it through fraud.
I think Margaret can answer this best, actually, because you were talking HMRC, because the campaigners are calling for a change in the law, not for necessarily a change in policy from HMRC. But you can explain that, Margaret.
No, we accept that the law is the law.
Yes, of course.
And if people take money out from a registered pension scheme before they're entitled to, which is the case in these scams, then they're due to pay a tax penalty. And that's fine. But the problem is the circumstances are quite different now. In the past, the law was set up to try and stop people, you know, avoiding tax by setting up ways that they could filter the money away, they could get cash out, and everybody would be happy. But it's not the same when somebody's persuaded by a third party to do something they would never contemplate doing. And around that time as well, people didn't know about these scams.
So what happens now?
Well, what happens now is that HMRC just constantly does what they need to do, which is collect.
But what happens to the victims?
The victims just go into a spiral of depression. Some have committed suicide. Some have lost their families. They've lost their houses. They're in dire straits. It's really tragic when you have to deal with victims. And you saw one on the clip. But if you spend, you know, a lot of time with these people, they are devastated.
Of course. Their future.
It's also interesting because whilst campaigners are dealing with HMRC, of course, campaigners are calling for a change in the law. Now, clearly, that is ministerial level. Now, I know the campaign group, they were due to meet a Treasury Minister next month. That's been brought forward, though, Margaret?
Yeah, it's been brought forward to Tuesday. So that's...
All of a sudden?
All of a sudden. That's encouraging because I've spent years trying to get their attention and suddenly they're interested. So that's fantastic. I'm sure there are lots of external factors driving that change, but I'm very encouraged that they're now prepared to listen.
Well, no doubt we'll be talking about this again after that meeting. Thank you both so much. Margaret Snowden, Chairman of Pension Scams, thank you. Dan, thank you. More on Money Box?
12 o'clock, Radio 4.
As usual, thanks.
Thanks, Dan.